it's very nice to be here, and there's no truth in the rumour that I'm accompanying the Australian Ashes team, but I know they will be over here shortly. But yes, I am originally from Brisbane, Australia, and I move in my teaching in Franciscan spirituality and also in philosophy of religion between Heathrow College in London and also at a theological centre in Melbourne called the Yarra Theological Union, named after, well, the Yarra comes from the Yarra River, on which Melbourne is located. And I wish to speak to you today about the topic of the talk is the origins of Franciscan theology, and focusing on St. Bonaventure. And I'd like to introduce some of his thought. I would say that when I speak about the origins of Franciscan theology, I suppose the real origins in one sense come from St. Francis and St. Clare themselves and their own experience. But St. Bonaventure was probably the first one to technically reflect on that experience, both of Francis and of Clare, and to speak about and to write about what he felt was its relevance for the wider world. But just having said that, then I'd firstly like to just fill in a little bit of the background about Bonaventure. We do know a lot about St. Francis because there were a lot of stories written about St. Francis. Indeed, the first life of St. Francis was written within a couple of years of his death, and there were many early legends, and no doubt if you've been attending all of the talks in this particular series, you would have been aware of those. With St. Bonaventure, it's somewhat different in terms of his personal history. What we do have are a lot of the actual writings of Bonaventure, things that he wrote, but we don't have a lot of writings about Bonaventure in terms of historically reliable writings. Bonaventure, as we'll see, died in 1274. He was canonised a saint in 1482. And it wasn't until he was canonised that there was an official life written about him in preparation for his canonisation. So that's something like 200 years between when he died and when he was canonised. Whereas with St. Francis, of course, being St. Francis, he was canonised within 2 years. So it's a different sort of historical source. So we don't know a lot about his actual life. We do know some things, and we have to be careful to separate out what is historically reliable and certain other things which were written about him but may not really be historically reliable. We won't go into that a lot. But we do have a lot of his writings, and I think we gain a lot of what he is about, I think, from delving into his writings. So relatively little is known of his early life. He was born in a place called Bonaventure. It's near Orvieto in Italy. I visited there a couple of times. If you ever get the chance to visit, they're a delightful little place, particularly the city centro area where they say Bonaventure's where he grew up, but a very beautiful sort of place, near Orvieto in Italy. His father Giovanni was a doctor in Bonaventure. His mother was Maria. Sometimes she was called Ritella. Even the year of Bonaventure's birth is debated by scholars. That's, how little historical accuracy we have about him. Some scholars place it as early as 1217. Others argue for a date as late as 1221, but the majority seem to come down to 1217, but we can't really be totally certain about it. At baptism he was named Giovanni after his father, and upon his entrance into the Franciscan order years later, his name was changed to Bonaventura, good things to come. And I think there were many good things that came out of the life of Bonaventure. It's said that his early schooling was with Franciscans at Bonaventure, and then he made his way to France, to Paris, to the great University of Paris, in order to equip himself for a profession. So he didn't specifically go there to study for ministry, or he may well have gone to study medicine because his father was a doctor. But he did certainly go to study at the University of Paris. And in those times, if you wished to equip yourself for a profession, it was a long period of study. You firstly had to study for 8 years to do what we call the artes, and then you had to specialise, if you wished to continue your study, in medicine, law or theology were the three great faculties. And in the case of theology, which Bonaventure was to specialise in, that was roughly around another 13 years. So when you start your first year till when you finish your theology studies, it's 21 years. So it's quite a period of time. But anyway, he began his studies for the artes, the degree in arts at the University of Paris, around about 1235. Now, shortly after his arrival in Paris, Alexander of Hales, he was probably the most illustrious master of the theology faculty in Paris at the time, he joined the Franciscan order. So Bonaventure came to Paris 1235, Francis had died in 1226. As you probably realise, the order had very rapidly expanded. So even by the time of the death of Francis, there were now thousands following his way in the Franciscan order. But anyway, Alexander of Hales, around about 1235, joined the Franciscan order. It wasn't a matter just of an individual scholar joining the order. Alexander continued to teach, and because he was like the professor of theology, he brought his chair with him. And so the Franciscan House of Studies was thus made an integral teaching part of the University of Paris. And as Bonaventure later confessed in his own writings, it was this phenomenon of bright, enthusiastic scholars entering the humble brotherhood, as he spoke of them, that convinced him that Francis's renewal of a radical gospel life was intended to expand and to permeate the entire church. And indeed, a lot of his time basically came to interpreting, spreading the message of Francis to the wider world. And in 1243, at the completion of his 8 years of the Artes, he joined the Franciscan order. He then completed his work for the bachelor's degree in Scripture in 1248. He lectured on the Bible for a further 2 years. One thing you will notice in Bonaventure's writings, his great familiarity with the text of the Bible. We can understand that, I think, when we see how many years he actually spent in the study of the Scripture, the study of the Bible. He then produced his commentary on the sentences of Peter Lombard, which was something that all graduates in theology produced at that time. He did that between 1250 and 1252. And after that, he was ready to receive his doctorate in theology. And he actually functioned as a regent master, the practicing, the master of the school of the Franciscans at Paris from 1254 to 1257. And a fellow teacher at the university at his time was Thomas Aquinas, whom you've probably heard of. So Bonaventure and Aquinas were around about the same time. And then in 1257, he was called from his position as the Master of Theology at the University of Paris to serve as the 7th Minister General of the Franciscan Order. And we do know that because there is, as he himself writes in the prologue to his great work, The Soul's Journey into God, he gives a little bit of history in the prologue himself, and he mentions that. So we do have something definite about that. So in 1257 he was elected. And following his election to this position, he found himself confronted with internal conflict within the order. So the history of it, well, I suppose it's always a problem when you have such a charismatic founder, that it's not too long before the followers tend to have different ways of understanding the charism. And so it wasn't too long after the time of Francis that there was, 1257, Bonaventure, that's 30 years after the time of Francis, there was quite a deal of internal conflict between basically those, to put it simply, those who wanted to go back to the original simplicity of Francis, living in the hermitages, the very basic way of life. Those who felt, well, if they were to carry out a ministry in the church, they needed to educate the younger friars, teach them scripture, theology, so that they could be effective in their mission of preaching, which required greater organisation. So those were basically the two sort of different sort of ways in which the things were being pulled at the time. So Bonaventure did not want a split within his order. He wanted to maintain unity. And he felt, well, if I really wish to maintain this unity, it's important that I do try to recapture something of the spirit of the founder, something of the spirit of St. Francis. And so in 1259, just 2 years after he was elected Minister General, he retired into the solitude of the Franciscan holy Mount La Verna, where St. Francis had experienced the stigmata in 1224. He did that in order to immerse himself more deeply in the spiritual world of the founder. So if you like, he went on an extended retreat, we might say today. From here was to emerge his most famous spiritual work, to use the Latin word, the Itinerarium Mentis in Deum, the soul's journey into God. That's the most famous, his most famous spiritual work. Bonaventure's writings, just to say briefly, we could basically, you have his academic works, which were written, I suppose, very much in his association with the university, his commentaries on the scriptures, his what we call the disputed questions on various theological topics, disputed questions on the knowledge of Christ, disputed questions on the Trinity, evangelical perfection, and so forth. So they're intended to be more of an academic nature. And then we have his more spiritual works. After he was elected Minister General, his writings still contain very much an academic sort of content and nature to them. If you read The Soul's Journey into God, some parts of it you've really got to work intellectually to get through it. But they did tend to have more of a spiritual nature in them. So that's just to say something briefly about that. As General, Bonaventure, he travelled quite a deal. He maintained a small base at the friary, a friary just outside of Paris. So he did keep contact with the university, and he was invited back from time to time to give series of lectures, or collations as they were called. Basically during Lent and Advent, the university would put on these series of talks, a bit like we're having here, and a lot of the university, those studying at the university and others would turn up. In fact, the final work which we have of his, called the Collations on the 6 Days, or the Hexameron, the 6 Days of Creation, which many would regard as his greatest sort of work, was basically a series of lectures he delivered at the university in 1273, the year before he died. So that's the last of the collections of his that we have. He was absent from Paris for long stretches of time. Occasionally he had to be present at the papal court in Rome, and don't forget they didn't have fast transport, so even if you travelled and said at a good speed of 20 miles a day, a trip from Paris to Italy would take nearly 2 months. And on the way he'd break the trip, he'd take detours in order to visit the friaries. He very much believed in keeping in touch with the troops on the ground, so to speak. And besides Paris and Rome, apparently he was able to travel to all of the countries in Western Europe during the course of his generalate. So he's a very active man, travelling a lot, looking after the affairs of what was becoming a very big order, trying to keep things all held together, working within the larger church, as we'll see, and at the same time also writing a lot. So he was a very active sort of person as well. In May of 1273, he was appointed cardinal by Gregory X. He'd previously refused an appointment to the Archbishop of York, but this time he accepted. He set out to meet the Pope in Italy, and they went off to Lyon together in order to prepare for the Second Council of Lyon, which was to convene in May of 1274. He took part in the preparation of the council, its execution. He was very influential in that council in the work of union between the Greeks and the Latins. And I mention that point because he was very much concerned with unity. It was one of his constant themes, unity, harmony. And so he was, even in the wider church, he was concerned about this union between groups who may have been separate from each other. And he died very suddenly on July the 15th, 1274, just 2 days before the termination of the council. I mentioned before that he taught around at the same time, not always at the same place as Thomas Aquinas. Bonaventure died at the Council of Lyon. Aquinas died on his way to the Council of Lyon. They both died in the same year, so the Council of Lyon was a bit of a dangerous place to be getting into. And then he was canonised by Sixtus IV in 1482. That's just a bit about his history. But what distinguishes the thought of Bonaventure from that, say, of his contemporary Thomas Aquinas. And if you read the two, their writings are very, not say opposed to each other, they have many agreements naturally, but they're different styles, certainly, different emphases. I think the answer to that question is what makes the thought of Bonaventure so distinctive is to be found in the person whom Bonaventure admired and loved so deeply, and that is St. Francis of Assisi. And as the theologian von Balthasar writes, he dedicates a whole lengthy chapter to Bonaventure in the second volume of his 7-volume work, The Glory of the Lord. And he writes, he says this, he said, when we speak of the Francis event, we have at last mentioned the living, organising centre of Bonaventure's intellectual world. Francis event being at the centre of Bonaventure's intellectual world. The thing that lifts it above the level of a mere interweaving of the threads of tradition. Bonaventure does not only take Francis as his centre, he is his own sun and his mission. And so one of the distinctive things I think about Bonaventure's theology is that he is inspired, the very core of his theology is religious experience, the experience of the saint. The experience of St. Francis of Assisi. The Jewish theologian Abraham Joshua von Heschel, he lamented the fact that he said too much of theology begins with the writings of the philosophers rather than the experience of the prophets. Well, Bonaventure was certainly one who began with the experience of the prophet, St. Francis of Assisi. And he certainly incorporated writings of philosophers, but his starting point was the experience of the prophet. The centrality of Francis is evident in the structure of Bonaventure's theology. Naturally, if we're dealing with a great theologian as Bonaventure, in the time we have available here, I can't cover every aspect of his theology. So I'm focusing basically, trying to fit in with the whole theme of these talks, embracing creation with love. I want to focus very much on the central place of love within his whole sort of theology, and some of the implications I'm going to mention briefly at the end that may have for embracing creation. So the centrality of Francis, as we said, is evident in the structure of his theology. A key element, as no doubt you've already heard within Francis's experience, is his experience of the stigmata on Mount La Verna, 1224, 2 years before he died. And Bonaventure makes this experience the central model for the great spiritual work I've already mentioned, the soul's journey into God. So this work of the itinerarium, as it's called, to use a Latin term, the journey, the itinerarium begins with a prologue, and then it contains 7 chapters which are concerned with the journey into God. It's interesting, in the title, in the Latin title, Bonaventure says itinerarium, the journey, mentis, the soul, sometimes translated mind. The soul in that time meant the deepest spiritual level of the human being, who we are at our deepest level as spiritual beings. And then he doesn't use ad deum, which would often come after iter, the Latin iter. He uses in. So into God, in other words, to experience, the experience of God, basically. The Latin in, I think, emphasises that. So it's not just moving towards God, it's the experience of God, which is the end point. Essentially, this work is a spiritual meditation or reflection. It focuses upon 3 major areas: a meditation or a contemplation, as he calls it, which is more than simply intellectual meditation, but contemplation of the natural world is the first area, which occurs chapters 1 and 2, contemplation of the self, our own self, which is chapters 3 and 4, and 4 of the self as redeemed by Christ. He's writing the soul's journey into God for Christians who already believe. Sometimes, if you see in philosophy of religion textbooks, the itinerarium is dealt with Bonaventure's producing proofs for the existence of God. That's complete nonsense. He didn't at all intend to write this as producing proofs for the existence of God. He presumes, and if you read the prologue, it's very evident, he presumes that the person who wishes to engage in this already believes in God. So he's not going to say, I'm going to prove that God exists. The person already believes in God, and prayer is very much at the beginning of it. So it's certainly not producing proofs of the existence of God. So meditation on the natural world, meditation on the self, contemplation of the self, and contemplation of the nature of God, chapters 5 and 6. And the aim of each of these contemplations is to deepen our understanding of the particular subject area under consideration, the natural world, the self, the nature of God, to assist the reader in coming to a deeper understanding and deeper knowledge. So these contemplations constitute the subject matter for the first 6 chapters. The 7th chapter is concerned with the final stage of the journey, that of mystical ecstasy, or the experience of God. And as indicated in the prologue, and again in the final chapter, the model for the successful completion of the journey that Bonaventure presents, the model is Francis of Assisi. And so in the prologue to the work, Bonaventure writes, he says, while I was there, that's on Mount Labona, reflecting on various ways by which the soul ascends into God, there came to mind, among other things, the miracle which had occurred to Blessed Francis in this very place, the vision of a winged seraph in the form of a crucified. While reflecting on this, I saw at once that this vision represented our Father's rapture in contemplation and the road by which this rapture is reached. And so I wish to use the prologue then as a starting point for this exploration into Bonaventure's theology, a theology which places at its centre desire and love. Desire and love. It's significant that Bonaventure uses the image of the seraph as the basic religious symbol in the itinerarium. As he writes in section 3 of the prologue, the 6 wings of the seraph can rightly be taken to symbolise the 6 levels of illumination, and hence we have 6 chapters of the book. It is important to consider Bonaventure's use of this term illumination within the wider context of his theory of knowing. What does knowing entail? The theory of knowledge, if you like. Well, in scholastic thought, not just in Bonaventure's thought, but in scholastic thought, the acquisition of knowledge is not merely acquiring new concepts or items of information, but rather it is the shaping of human consciousness by the reality that stands before us. How our human consciousness, our awareness of ourselves and our place in the world is shaped by the reality that I am confronted with. So a concept is not an arbitrary sign attached to the mind, but it is the shaping of the mind itself by the reality that confronts it. And so in this sense, the act of knowing calls for an active relationship between the knower, myself, and that which I know. It is relational. At its very basis, knowing is relational. So for Bonaventure, knowledge is not impersonal, as if I simply know some impersonal fact out there. It is inherently relational. It entails my being changed by that which I come to know. And this active relationship between myself and that which I know is described by Bonaventure in terms of illumination. So understood within this context, illumination is the influence of that which, while existing in its own right outside of myself, impacts dynamically upon me. And it illumines the mind, it illumines me through bringing new understanding, a new capacity to know. So in this sense, when I come to know something, I then also have a new capacity to know because I am changed through that experience. And then insofar as that which is known now exists in the mind, if you like, as intelligible, it has become a part of myself, it can be said to illumine from within. And I think it's important to we get some of these terms used, we think they're all very mysterious, but basically when I've learnt something, I've come to know something, I am illumined by it, I'm illumined from within. And this illumination from within is a central Bonaventurean notion. So the symbol of the seraph, I'll come back to the seraph here, is central when he speaks about how we grow in knowledge. The 6 wings of the seraph symbolise the 6 stages of illumination of how we come to know more deeply. And this is important, that the symbol of the seraph stands for this, because Bonaventure basically speaks of this not primarily for historical reasons. We're not saying he wasn't concerned with history, but for theological reasons. I think even when you approach Bonaventure's life of Francis, you've got to be aware that it's not simply writing a history of St. Francis, he includes that, but basically he presents a theological vision of St. Francis. That's his primary purpose, without disregarding the historical element, but the primary purpose is theological, not historical in our modern understanding of historical. So throughout his writings, Bonaventure also drew extensively on the work of the pseudo-Dionysius, the 6th century Syrian spiritual writer, Dionysian thought. And it's here that we will discover the symbolic richness of Bonaventure's use of the seraph. In chapter 7 of the Dionysian work, The Celestial Hierarchy, we see the following description of the angelic seraphim. And to quote from this Celestial Hierarchy, for the designation seraphim really teaches this. This is the angelology of Dionysius, all the angels have the different functions, and he's speaking here about the seraphim. The seraphim teaches this, a perennial circling around the divine things, penetrating warmth, the overflowing heat of a movement which never falters and never fails. So the seraphim are the angels closest to the throne of God in the Dionysian presentation. And each of the levels of angels are assigned particular functions in the Dionysian corpus. The primary function of the seraphim is to love God, to love God. They burn because of the ardour of their love. This is why they are spoken about as being a flame with the ardour of love. And in his spiritual work, The Triple Way, Bonaventure focuses upon this. He said, on the third level, truth is to be adored by sacrifice and praise, which pertains to the thrones. It is to be admired in ecstasy and contemplation, which pertains to the cherubim. It is to be embraced, the words here, embraced with caresses and love, which pertains to the seraphim. To be embraced with caresses and love, which pertains to the seraphim. So to use the seraphim as the central symbol in speaking about a journey in which one comes to know in a deeper way the world, the self and God, is to highlight the centrality of love in this journey. And it's important to note that Bonaventure speaks of love within the context of the Latin term, the affectus, the will, that which we desire, that which we value. This is the affectus. It lies within the realm of what Pascal called the reasons of the heart. But lest one think that Bonaventure is a pure voluntarist, that we decide simply on the basis of what the heart urges us, it's also good to remember that Bonaventure, master of the University of Paris, in no way sought to denigrate the use of the intellect. He had a very powerful intellect and used it to its full extent. In his work on the reduction of the arts to theology, he includes all of the intellectual disciplines then taught at the university as ways in which we can come to grow in the knowledge of God. So all the disciplines of the university are seen by Bonaventure as ways in which we can come to grow in the knowledge of God. And he, just to quote him from the end of that, the last section of that particular work, he says, and so it is evident how the manifold wisdom of God, which is clearly revealed in sacred scripture, lies hidden in all knowledge and in all nature. The wisdom of God lies hidden in all knowledge and in all nature. It's likewise clear how wide the illuminative way may be, the illuminative growing in our knowledge, and how the divine reality itself lies hidden within everything which is perceived or known. The divine reality lies hidden in everything that's perceived or known. There's no division between the sacred and the secular. Okay, the divine wisdom is present in everything, in all knowledge, in everything which is perceived or known. And the intellect has an essential role in the search for God. But the search will only reach its end, its final point, through the involvement of the heart, the affectus. And so he finishes his, with the reduction of the arts to theology, he says, and this is the fruit of all sciences, of all learning, of all knowledge, that in all faith may be strengthened, God may be honoured, character may be formed, and consolation may be derived from union of the spouse with the beloved, a union which takes place through charity, a charity without which all knowledge is vain. So all knowledge is vain without charity, drawing on St. Paul, of course. Something which Bonaventure, I believe, was convinced about. Bonaventure's program is not a matter of either the intellect or the will, of either head or heart. He speaks of a synthesis between the two. The acquisition of knowledge entails the pursuit of the mind and the pursuit of the heart. In his prologue to the Itinerarium, he counsels the reader not to believe, he said, that reading, and for him reading of philosophy, as you go to read philosophy or the teaching of philosophy, that reading is sufficient without affection, the involvement of the will, speculation without devotion, investigation, all of these intellectual disciplines without wonder. So the heart, we have wonder about what you have learned, the breadth of investigation, the great breadth of knowledge, observation without joy. Okay, the joy that when we realise the magnificence of God's creation through our disciplines of study brings joy. Work without piety, knowledge without love. So he holds the two together, okay, the intellect and the heart. In his own writings, Bonaventure uses a variety of words in speaking about what we term knowledge. The first is scientia, the Latin scientia. And we have science, of course, from that. Scientia is a term employed to speak about the knowledge which is gained when we use our ability to reason, to reflect upon our experience of the world. This is the knowledge which pertains to the intellect, intellectual or scientific knowledge. But it's important to note that in medieval times, the world in which Bonaventure was writing, the word scientia also had a more precise technical meaning, the Aristotelian meaning of reasoning, which goes from premises to a conclusion, or more pointedly, from the known to the unknown. Okay, A equals B, B equals C, therefore A equals C, is that right? So you move from what is known, the premises, to what previously was not known. So this movement from the known to the unknown. And that's in keeping with Bonaventure's conviction that the world has a sacred dimension, the human person has a capacity for the infinite, for the mystery, if you like. As already mentioned, Bonaventure stressed the great importance of scientia in the religious quest. Scientia, our intellectual knowledge, forms the substance and the foundation which allows the movement into the second dimension of knowledge, that in which scientia is transformed into sapientia. Intellectual knowledge is transformed into wisdom. In medieval usage, sapientia was a term which was used to define that which ought to be the end purpose of all study, a knowledge which derives from the infusion of intelligence with love. And in the prologue, Bonaventure is urging the reader to undertake the journey into God, not only by way of scientia, the intellect, but more importantly, by way of sapientia, wisdom, And I think in our own world, the need for wisdom is as much evident today as it was in the time of Bonaventure. We have a lot of information. Do we know how to deal with that information wisely? Do we have the wisdom? Because it's our values which will determine how the information we have, the knowledge, intellectual knowledge we have, is put to use for destructive purposes or for the human welfare. So that comes down to wisdom, that which we value, that which we love. So according to Bonaventure, the knowledge which we have of the world around us, scientia, is symbolic in nature. Great on symbolic theology, drew very much on Hugh of St. Victor, the nature of symbolic theology. And so when one approaches the objects of this knowledge, knowledge of the world, in a spirit of contemplatio, contemplation. Contemplation basically gazing at. It's not something reserved for, great saints' contemplation. It is simply pausing, gazing at, paying attention to, evoking an attitude of reverence and awe towards that which one contemplates. But when we approach what we know in the spirit of contemplation, it becomes possible for Bonaventure to accept these realities in their full significance as realities which are symbols of the divine presence. So Bonaventure's faith conviction, he doesn't go out to prove that, but he believes, he begins with his own faith, that the world flows from God and that therefore everything in some way reflects God, capturing the experience of Francis of Assisi, of course, in which he praised God through all of creation, the canticle and other associations with St. Francis. So to accept the realities as symbols of the divine presence. And it is at this moment that we acquire the knowledge which Bonaventure terms sapientia. And what's crucial here is the affectus, as I mentioned, desire. Sapientia entails the involvement not only of the human intellect, but also of human desire, which specifies that which we value in life, that which we love. The goal of scientia is to prepare for and lead to sapientia. The goal of the intellect is to prepare for and lead to the realms of value and of love. Early in his academic career, in his commentaries on the sentences of Peter Lombard, Bonaventure clearly states his understanding of the purpose of theology. So he said, the knowledge presented in this book is of this sort, for this knowledge helps faith, and faith is related to the intellect in such a way that great as the intellect is in itself, its nature is to move the affect, the affectus. And this is clear. For this knowledge, this intellectual knowledge, tells us that Christ has died for us and similar things, and it moves a person to love. Okay, the intellectual knowledge moves a person to love. And I love this phrase here. It must be conceded that we do theology so far that we may become good people. That's why we engage in theology, to become good people. So we could write 10 volumes of brilliant theology, but if it hasn't made us a better person, according to Bonaventure, we've wasted our time. We do theology to become good people. But the final term we need to examine in Bonaventure's understanding of knowledge and its relationship to love is his use of the concept of ecstasis, or ecstatic knowledge. And we find his detailed treatment of ecstasis in his disputed questions on the knowledge of Christ. In question 6, he observes that it is never possible for the human mind to comprehend God. That is, to fully and completely understand God, because God is infinite and we're finite. Consequently, he comments, knowledge of God is not to be spoken of in terms of comprehensive knowledge or scientia. The human intellect is incapable of comprehending God. Can it be said then that is it at all possible? We can't comprehend God, and if that's the only meaning of knowledge, is it possible for the human person to know God? That's an important question. Can we know God? We can't comprehend God, so is it possible for us to know God at all? Bonaventure answers this question in the affirmative. He said it is possible to come to know God. But this is brought about not by attempting to comprehend God, but by desiring God. Drawing both on the experience of St. Francis of Assisi and Dionysian theology, he argues that God is to be understood above all else as the highest good. We see that so often in the prayers of St. Francis, you are good, all good, the highest good. And we also see in the Dionysian work, the first name given to God is the highest good. So he combines the experience with the spiritual theological tradition. So God is the highest good. We desire that which we see as good from our experience, going back drawing on Aristotle there. Since God is the highest good, God is desirable above all else. And so he writes in the question 6, he says, the soul is not satisfied with any good which it grasps and comprehends, since no such good is the highest. I read once of a mathematician who worked for 28 years on solving some problem in mathematics. I know very little about mathematics, so I'm not sure what the problem was. But after 28 years, he finally solved it. So his whole life had been dedicated to doing this, but he commented after that, well, what am I going to do now? So, anyway, so we're not, once we've grasped and comprehended something, we want to move on. We're not satisfied with it any longer. It's satisfied only by a good of such a sort that a soul is taken captive by its greatness and super excellence. So that's the difference. We're taken captive by its greatness, its super excellence. Note the superlative going above, if you like. Not only excellent, it's super excellence. It's common to identify knowledge with comprehension. The type of knowledge we have of God, however, is not comprehensive knowledge for Bonaventure, it is ecstatic knowledge. And Bonaventure incorporates the Dionysian language of ecstasy, ecstasis, to mean standing outside oneself, standing outside our customary way of understanding in order to be able to receive a new understanding that is shaped by the experience of being drawn beyond oneself, captivated by the desire for the other. And in the Epilogue to De Scientia Christi, he describes ecstatic knowledge as that ultimate and most exalted form of knowledge, the ultimate form of knowledge. He furthers the Dionysian concept of ecstatic knowledge by associating it fundamentally with love. It is in the relationship of love between the self and the other that the quest for the knowledge of the other reaches its fulfillment. The highest form of knowledge is to be found in the certitude of the relationship of love. It is a knowing that is a loving, and a loving that is a knowing. Ecstatic knowledge is to find its consummation in the experience of the other, whoever the other is, and that experience is grounded in love. And Bonaventure speaks of ecstatic knowledge in reference to St. Francis. In chapter 7 of his Itinerarium he writes, "This was shown also to Blessed Francis when, in ecstatic contemplation on the height of the mountain, there appeared to him a six-winged seraph fastened to a cross." It's interesting to see how Bonaventure speaks of this state of ecstasy when he writes about the stigmata of Francis in chapter 13 of his Life of St. Francis. The stigmata is not an isolated incident as presented by Bonaventure, but is presented within the framework of a continuous circular pattern of movement, the pattern of ascent and descent. And he begins this chapter 13, "Francis had made it his habit never to relax in his pursuit of the good. Rather, like the heavenly spirits on Jacob's ladder, he either ascended to God or descended to his neighbour." So Francis ascends Mount La Verna, he encounters God and the ecstatic contemplative experience of the stigmata, and then it is said he descends the mountain to continue his ministry among lepers. He is taken out of himself, seized by rapture in contemplation, and continues this movement beyond self in focusing his attention not on self but on the other in his embrace of the leper. In his stigmata there is ecstasy in contemplation. In his leper ministry there is ecstasy in compassion. Both are ways in which Francis engages in what we can call an ecstatic way of knowing. So what relevance might Bonaventure's thought have for today? I believe that his synthesis of scientia and affectus and his concept of ecstatic knowledge give support to those today who call for an understanding of knowledge that goes beyond the boundaries imposed by 20th century logical positivism and empiricism. What is called for is a wider understanding of knowledge than that which is obtained through detached empirical investigation. We might draw a comparison with our understanding or knowledge of other people. If knowledge has been understood as that which is obtained through an attitude of impersonal critical detachment, then since our understanding of other people naturally involves trust and love, that's the way we know other people, which are the opposites of detachment, we're going to be forced to re-examine our understanding of knowledge and its relationship with love. We need to free ourselves from those empirical restrictions which have been placed upon our understanding of knowledge. We need to take into account the way that people actually know. And this includes above all that we consider the nature of the knowledge people have of each other. What then becomes clear is that there exists a reciprocal relationship between knowledge and love, which Bonaventure constantly speaks about. To say that we know through loving and trusting by no means entails that reason is excluded. Trust in a person engages the emotions, the imagination and the will because it engages the whole person, and by that same token it engages the intellect as well. The more a person is able to love, the more discerning is the critical rational faculty, and the wiser sapientia is the judgment which is made. What is fundamental is the pivotal place of relationship. As I mentioned, Bonaventure's theory of knowledge, of knowing, is inherently relational. An ecstatic way of knowing always involves relationship between the knower and the other that is known. The nature of this relationship is not that of control or possession of the known by the knower. Rather, as already mentioned, in an ecstatic way of knowing, the knower stands outside oneself, stands outside one's customary way of understanding in order to be able to receive a new understanding that is shaped by the experience of the other. All knowing for Bonaventure is essentially relational, and the knower comes to deeper understanding through an encounter with the reality of the other, an encounter which does not control, but which enables the knower to be drawn by the other to deeper and newer ways of knowing and understanding. Knowing is far more than simply an impersonal intellectual exercise. And so there are many possible implications here, but just to briefly mention one, that of ecological concerns. I wish to finish with this, and this is very brief. But ecological concerns arise from the interactions between human beings and their non-human environment. And part of the ecological predicament that the world finds itself in today is due to a vision of life that predominated human thinking from the 16th and 17th centuries, an understanding of the world as a machine. This mechanistic view of the universe reached its high point with the Industrial Revolution, the parent of modern civilization. Now, one does not wish to be Luddite and condemn all aspects of the scientific and technological revolution, but the dark side of the positive achievements is noticeable. The over-exploitation of the Earth's natural resources, large-scale pollution, and economic division, which has seen massive wealth fall into the hands of a few, while the majority of the Earth's population live in poverty. What often appears to be lacking is a sense of balance. And the recovery of an appropriate sense of balance, I believe, can only come about when we rediscover the central aspect of what is involved in an ecstatic way of knowing. That the knower exists in relationship to whatever is known. An ecstatic way of knowing entails that our world is not simply an impassive object out there, but rather it is that with which we enter into relationship. Think of St. Francis's canticle, Brother Sun, Sister Moon, the spiritual relationship with all of creation, which Bonaventure then theologizes about. It's that with which we are engaged, our world. A mechanistic view of the universe results in disengagement. Disengagement views the human person as the investigator, observing the environment from a completely detached point of view. If disengagement is the norm, then the ultimate consequences can only be negative and destructive. But the notion of relationship, fundamental to Bonaventure's whole theory of knowledge, or his understanding of the process of knowing, this notion of relationship is so central to the way the world is. It lies at the heart of the biblical doctrine of creation that stresses the relationship between human nature and God's other creatures and the whole cosmos. And so when we come to know the world in an ecstatic way, so I think this ecstatic ecstasis needs, sometimes we speak of the saints in ecstasy as if it's an otherworldly thing or something just reserved for, these very special sort of human beings. All people can be involved in this ecstatic way of knowing. But when we do come to know the world in an ecstatic way, we are respecting the nature of the world as it is, not simply controlling it for what we wish it to be. In this ecstatic engagement with the world, we do not seek simply to change or manipulate or dominate that which we know, but we allow our own self-understanding to be deepened through our encounter with that which is the other. So there were just a few brief thoughts about maybe an ecological attitude in these matters, which I think is very much come through Bonaventure's whole understanding of knowledge itself. And as I mentioned, Bonaventure drawing so much in his theology on the experience of St. Francis. So we've got 10 minutes left for questions.
So if you'd like to ask a question, please do put up your hand and I'll bring the microphone to you. And then you can...
Paul, thank you for your talk. I'm going to ask a basic question about why Franciscan way spread so quickly, so rapidly. Let's take as given the work of the Holy Spirit, and let's take as given people's recognition of the centrality of love. But what else was happening? That it just exploded.
The Franciscan way. I think at the particular time in the 1200s, there was a great desire for general renewal within the church. There were many groups that were calling for a return to the simplicity of the gospel. And I think the early Franciscan movement, I think one of the things that was very much at the heart of it was St. Francis's own way of his own experience and his instructions to his followers. It's mentioned that what lay at the heart of very much of his message was the spirit of joy, the spirit of peace. For example, when he instructed his friars in his testament that when they went out on their mission of preaching, they would always begin, "May the Lord give you peace." And it's been noted how this contrasted with other sort of penitential groups of the time, who often tended to speak down to people or tick them off. You know, you're not leading good lives. How dare you do all these things? Francis's approach was "May the Lord give you peace." This desire for peace, the simplicity of the lifestyle, I think was something which made a great impact on the time. And I think at the heart of it all was the focus on Jesus. The humanity of Christ, the way of life. I think that was so very central to it. Bonaventure, I chose not to go into that today. His theology is very Christocentric, and I love one of the passages where he speaks. He says, "Likewise, the Son of God." Okay, the Son of God, and then he says, "The small, the poor, the humble one." So immediately God being identified with the small, poor, humble. A lot of room for thought just in a few words there. So I think this, the way, the simplicity of the presentation of Christ in a way that spoke to the hearts of people, I think that would be and the joy and the peacefulness, I suppose. Anyone else?
I was just wondering whether the ecstatic, I think, was a progression to where you want to get to, or whether in fact the ecstatic is meant to be from the very beginning in your relationship with God. And I just wonder whether the connection is with the idea of union with God. Was Bonaventure, do you think that union was something that you came to, or was it something you always had?
I think with the experience, I suppose, of what we might call the depths of God's love is, for Bonaventure certainly, is something that one is drawn to. It's not something that we can necessarily work towards. This ultimate, say, the experience of which he sees exemplified in the life of St. Francis. Certainly for Bonaventure, we are united with God in the sense, we cannot exist without that. But to experience the depths of love, I think the presence of God in the deepest way possible. Same as, I suppose, our experience of the presence of other people. There are many differing ways in which we experience other people. We may always experience a person in some way, but there are times in which we may experience a person in a deeper way. But for Bonaventure, it was always something we can dispose ourselves, if you like, through contemplation, but it is something basically that happens to us, not something we can expect or demand even.
questions.
Perhaps just not a real question, but you said we can't try to comprehend God because God is infinite and we are finite. But Bonaventure said that yes, but you can with desire. If you have a desire, means that it's faith, isn't it? You have to have faith.
On faith, yes. Yes, so,
How does one have faith?
sorry?
How does one have faith?
How does one have faith? Well, that's a very deep question.
You see, or perhaps you have had faith and then you start doubting it. So you say you can't comprehend God unless because He's infinite and you're faith.
And what Bonaventure there is thinking about our intellectual understanding, I suppose, in a sense reflecting, Thomas Aquinas, we cannot say what God is, or we can say what God is not. So we can't comprehend God in that intellectual sense, but we can desire God. What Bonaventure says in the beginning of the soul's journey, that the writer of chapter 1, prayer is the mother and the source of the ascent. And so I suppose in that sense, and he says that he speaks of prayer not in the sense of saying prayers, but he speaks in prayers in terms of what he calls the groaning of the heart and desire. And everything is within the context. I suppose faith, that's a very personal thing, but it's in that context of prayer, the groaning of the heart. He says, don't rush through it. He said, we must mull these things over slowly. Prayer, I think, is for him is essential.
Yeah, but he believes in the intellect, so the questioning is this
For sure. He does,
I like that.
He does, I think, faith seeking understanding, certainly, with Augustine's,
Very interesting.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. Thank you very much for your talk, and can we give you a round of applause? Thanks very much. Just to remind you, if you'd like to make a contribution to this series of talks, please do. There's a bowl at the back. Next week we have got Brother Samuel, I think, talking about ecology. And I'd just like to share a thought with you. And there were two words that kept on ringing to me in that talk you've just given. One was Noah, and the other one was Saul. Well, Noah made me think about creation and how Noah has to float on the water to get to the new understanding. But the story that came to my mind was, imagine you're a modern man and you go up into a tree and you ask, what is it that modern man saw? Did you appreciate the environment, or did you cut off the branch?